One morning, money still worked. By evening, it didn't. Shops were open, salaries were paid, prices were posted, and life looked normal. Then trust cracked. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once. In 1923 Germany, people discovered something terrifying. Money can exist and still be worthless. A single loaf of bread cost billions of marks, not because bread became rare, but because belief collapsed. Workers rushed from factories straight to markets before prices changed again. Parents watched savings built over decades evaporate in weeks. Banknotes piled higher each day, yet bought less each hour. This wasn't chaos caused by panic. Panic came later. This was order failing quietly. Systems still ran. Governments still spoke. But reality no longer listened. And this moment matters more than any textbook theory because it reveals a truth history keeps repeating. Economic collapse doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks familiar. Until suddenly, it isn't. Most nations fall at this stage. They wait. They assume correction will come. They believe institutions will restore balance. But history shows something uncomfortable. A few countries didn't wait. They moved while everything was still breaking. And those choices decided who vanished and who came back. When money stopped working, something else took its place. Not gold, not silver, not promises, skills, output, practical value. During collapse, prices stop explaining reality. Problems do. Who can grow food? Who can fix machines? Who can transport goods? Who can produce something useful today? In Germany, farmers didn't negotiate prices, they set them. Craftsmen didn't worry about inflation, their work fed families. Currency became secondary to function. This pattern wasn't unique. After World War II, Japan had destroyed cities, weak currency, and no global power. What it had was discipline, technical learning, and relentless production. South Korea followed the same path decades later, starting poor, resource-limited, and unstable. These countries didn't wait for trust to return. They rebuilt trust through output. Factories before finance, skills before speculation, production before prediction. And here is the mistake most nations make. They try to save money instead of saving function. They protect institutions instead of rebuilding capability. Recovery never begins in markets. It begins where value is created despite instability. This is the invisible mechanism behind every real economic comeback. Collapse alone doesn't destroy nations. Bad decisions afterward do. History is filled with countries that survived the fall but failed the recovery. The reason is always the same. They tried to go back instead of moving forward. Leaders focused on restoring old currencies, old systems, old power structures, believing stability could be printed or announced. But collapse permanently changes behavior. Once trust breaks, it doesn't return on command. People stop believing promises, they stop waiting, they adapt on their own. And governments that fight this reality always lose. Inflation controls without production create shortages. Bailouts without reform create dependency. Stability theater replaces real recovery. This is where nations bleed slowly. Not through chaos, but through stagnation. Capital flees, talent leaves, productivity collapses. And the country doesn't die dramatically. It just becomes irrelevant. This happened again and again across the 20th century. Nations with resources failed. Nations with institutions failed. Nations with money failed. Because recovery is not about what you have. It's about what you do when what you had no longer works. And the countries that survived understood one brutal rule. You cannot save demand without rebuilding supply. You cannot protect consumption without restoring production. Ignore this, and collapse becomes permanent. The countries that came back made uncomfortable choices early. They cut illusions before cutting costs. They accepted short-term pain to rebuild long-term function. Japan rebuilt factories before fixing currency credibility. South Korea forced export discipline before consumer comfort. Germany, after collapse and war, focused relentlessly on industrial output, vocational training, and trade credibility. These decisions were unpopular. Living standards didn't improve overnight. Growth was slow at first, but something critical returned. Trust. Not trust in money, trust in capability. Workers believed effort mattered again. Businesses believed production had value again. Foreign partners believed trade was reliable again. And once that trust returned, capital followed naturally. Stability didn't lead to growth. Growth created stability. This is the reversal most people misunderstand. Recovery is never announced. It is built quietly, step by step, through boring, disciplined execution. The nations that rose didn't gamble on miracles. They engineered resilience. And that difference explains why some countries today still carry the scars of collapse, while others turned catastrophe into strength. Modern economies look stronger, but they break faster. Past collapses unfolded over years. Today, they unfold in weeks. Supply chains are longer, leverage is higher, and trust is thinner. Entire industries depend on systems they don't control. Food depends on fuel. Fuel depends on finance. Finance depends on confidence. When one fails, everything feels it. Digital money moves instantly, but so does panic. A rumor spreads faster than policy. A bank run can begin before officials finish speaking. And most people misunderstand this risk. They believe diversification protects them. They believe institutions are too large to fail. They believe history already happened and can't repeat itself. But collapse doesn't repeat. It adapts. The triggers change. The outcome doesn't. When systems become complex, resilience doesn't come from size. It comes from redundancy and function. The countries that survive modern shocks are the ones that reduce dependence, shorten supply chains, and prioritize real output over financial appearance. Fragility isn't about weakness. It's about dependence on things you cannot control. When people imagine collapse, they picture empty shelves and chaos. That's the wrong picture. The real danger is slow failure. Jobs that still exist but pay less each month. Savings that still sit in accounts but buy less each year. Systems that technically function but no longer work for people. This is how collapse feels in real time. Quiet, administrative, gradual. And this is why most preparation fails. People stockpile money instead of skills. They chase assets instead of adaptability. They trust titles instead of capability. History shows a different truth. Those who survive aren't the most informed. They're the most useful. They can produce, repair, teach, organize, and adapt. They don't predict the future. They respond to the present. Nations that recover follow the same pattern. They stop pretending stability can be restored by confidence alone. They rebuild value where it actually lives, in people who can do things that matter when systems weaken. This is the lesson collapse teaches every generation. The question is never whether systems fail. The question is whether you are prepared to function when they do. Strip away money, strip away institutions, strip away confidence, and something still remains. Function. History is clear on this. When collapse removes comfort, it exposes reality. People don't survive because they predicted the crisis. They survive because they could operate inside it. The same is true for nations. Countries that recovered didn't guess the future correctly. They built systems that worked even when conditions were bad. They invested in people who could produce value without permission from stability. Skills that didn't require perfect markets. Industries that didn't depend on fragile supply chains. Education that wasn't speculative but practical. This is why recovery looks boring in real time. No dramatic announcements, no instant rebounds. Just consistent execution while others argue. And this is where the final illusion breaks. Collapse is not a reset. It is a filter. It removes what only works in ideal conditions. It preserves what works under pressure. The countries that came back understood this early. They didn't chase growth, they built resilience, and resilience quietly outlasted everything else. Every collapse leaves behind the same lesson, and every generation believes it will be different this time. Systems fail, trust breaks, stability disappears. What remains is function. This is not pessimism, it's clarity. The nations that survived history's worst economic disasters were not the richest, the loudest, or the most confident. They were the most adaptable. They rebuilt value where it actually lives, in people, in skills, in production, in discipline. And this brings the story back to now. Because history is not asking whether another collapse will happen. It is asking who will be ready when it does. Will value come from promises or from capability? Will survival come from assets or from usefulness? Will recovery come from waiting or from building? That question has already been answered before. The only uncertainty is whether we choose to learn from it. If this perspective changed how you see economic stability, share what stood out to you. Because the conversations we avoid today become the lessons we are forced to learn tomorrow.